Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to read you the Supreme Court decision that ruled against the Democratic Party and for the Republican Party and President Trump. But before I do, 16 states have postponed their primaries. Here's the list: Alaska, Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Hawaii, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, West Virginia, Wyoming, and Puerto Rico have rescheduled their contests. Okay, why didn't Wisconsin? This is the New York Times I'm reading. Wisconsin didn't, and I'll read you a March 18th article. Democrats sue Wisconsin officials to extend the date for early voting. All right. Instead of simply telling this was on March 18th. Instead of simply telling people, hey, look, they have the email list, they have the phone numbers, they have enough money to simply say, hey, look, we have an election in a couple of weeks. You better get in your absentee ballots before a certain date. If you don't, they won't be counted. Instead of simply doing that, they sued. They went to the Supreme Court, and the reason they didn't reschedule was, but the Wisconsin primary scheduled for April 7th includes numerous state, local, and municipal elections that would be more difficult to reschedule than just a presidential primary, because some involve a transfer of executive power. It doesn't say impossible to reschedule. It doesn't say, they cannot by any means reschedule. It says more difficult to reschedule. Oh, that's too bad. Well, we have a crisis. So it's because it's more difficult to reschedule, you're the people, you're the ones who forced your voters, Democrats, to go in the rain, to just stand in lines in the rain, in the cold, with hail, 3-inch thick hail pelting people as they're holding umbrellas, getting soaking wet in the middle of a pandemic, where you don't want to reopen the country because 7 out of the 10 top states with the most cases are run by Democratic governors, and New York, unfortunately, leads the country by well over 100,000 cases and like around 7,000 more lives lost than the next state, 6 or 7,000 more. I mean, how Andrew Cuomo gets away with just simply, becoming America's governor for what? Completely ignoring the signs of even on March 1st, he said the general risk for New York remains low. He tweeted this out. There's no reason for undue anxiety. March 1st. And look at the state New York is in at this moment. So, anyway. There's also an election for the state Supreme Court justice. This article in the New York Times does not say they couldn't reschedule their state elections. But anyway, if you read the actual ruling, Wisconsin has decided this is the right ruling. They did a good job. You can't simply extend voting past the deadline simply under the guise of, it's a crisis. You either reschedule your election. Well, here, I'll read you this, okay? This is the actual Republican National Committee versus Democratic National Committee, Supreme Court of the United States. This is the actual judgment, okay, ruling, Supreme Court ruling. Wisconsin has decided to proceed with the election scheduled for Tuesday, April 7th. The wisdom of that decision is not the question before the court. The wisdom of that decision is not the question before the court. The Supreme Court had nothing to do with the Democratic Party keeping its election on April 7th. So when you hear people say, you know what, the Republicans and the 5 conservative justices made people choose between democracy and their health. Well, it shouldn't be choosing between voting and risking your life or your health shouldn't be a choice. You simply don't. You don't vote and you take care of your health and your well-being. If indeed you think this pandemic is worthy of 17 million people unemployed. But let's just let's just continue. The wisdom of that decision is not the question before the court. The court did not decide, had no jurisdiction or no judgment on whether or not Democrats were to keep their voting for April 7th. That was entirely the decision of Democrats. And it was also entirely the decision of Democrats to not postpone the state elections because it would be too difficult for them, not because they couldn't, okay? So now you're taking it from, oh my God, voters were forced between being disenfranchised, and no, they weren't. Democrats could have simply postponed the state elections. They chose not to. Why? Because it would be too difficult. That's the New York Times. Okay, but here the question before the court is a narrow technical question about the absentee ballot process. In this court, all agree that the deadline for the municipal clerks to receive absentee ballots has been extended from Tuesday, April 7th to Monday, April 13th. Okay, that's also not challenged by the Supreme Court. Okay, so whether or not they held the primary, the Supreme Court doesn't care. Okay, so don't say the Supreme Court forced them to hold the primary, and whether or not they extended the absentee ballot date from Tuesday, April 7th to Monday, April 13th, that's not the issue either. That extension, which is not challenged in this court, has afforded Wisconsin voters several extra days in which to mail their absentee ballots. So what's the problem? Check this out. This is unbelievable. It's very, very, this is the epitome of Democratic Party logic. The epitome of liberal logic, or I should say Democratic Party logic. The sole question before the court is whether absentee ballots now must be mailed and postmarked by Election Day, Tuesday, April 7th, as state law would necessarily require. Okay. Or instead be mailed and postmarked after Election Day, so long as they are received by Monday, April 13th. So Democrats wanted not just an extension, not just to vote on that day, but they wanted to be able, after the election, after Election Day, instead maybe mailed and postmarked after Election Day. What? The Democratic Party wanted absentee ballots, wanted the right to have absentee ballots mailed after Election Day? How does that work? I mean, haven't they cheated enough? Look at the DNC emails. I mean, how cutthroat can they be? You have the two operatives who were forced to resign in 2016 were for fomenting violence in Trump rallies. So, how duplicitous and disingenuous can they be? The sole question before the court is whether absentee ballots now must be mailed and postmarked by Election Day, Tuesday, April 7th, okay, which is normal, that's what, as state law would necessarily require, or instead may be mailed and postmarked after Election Day, so long as they are received by Monday, April 13th. Importantly, in their preliminary injunction motions, the plaintiffs did not ask the district court allow ballot mails mailed and postmarked after Election Day, April 7th, to be counted. So this is a new request the Democrats had. That is a critical point in the case. Nonetheless, 5 days before the scheduled election, the district court unilaterally ordered that absentee ballots mailed and postmarked after Election Day, April 7th, still be counted so long as they are received by April 13th. So just think of all the different ways you could cheat in an election, which Democrats are known to do. Okay? They're known to do it in their primaries. And we don't have to go on. We don't have to talk about, like I mentioned, two Democratic operatives were forced to resign in 2016 for actually fomenting violence at Trump rallies. And then the media runs with, oh my God, the Trump rallies are violent. Okay, that was covered by CNN. Then you have the ballot harvesting issue, which is also a big topic that the Federalist covered. There's a great Federalist article on that. I'm not going to trust Democrats, and nobody should trust Republicans either, with absentee ballots that are mailed after an election. That is absurd. I don't care what the issue is. They say, well, it's a crisis. Okay, then why even then postpone everything? 16 states already did. That is a critical point in the case. Nonetheless, 5 days before the scheduled election, the district court unilaterally ordered that absentee ballots mailed and postmarked after Election Day, April 7th, still be counted so long as they are received by April 13th, extending the date. So obviously, the Supreme Court overruled that. Extending the date by which ballots may be cast by voters, not just received by municipal clerks, but cast by voters for an additional 6 days after the scheduled election day fundamentally alters the nature of the election. Democrats wanted, check this out, this is in the Supreme Court ruling right here, they wanted extending the date by which ballots may be cast by voters for an additional 6 days after the scheduled election day fundamentally alters the nature of the election. Yeah, gee, you think? I mean, they want any reason to just cheat. They want any reason. And this is absurd. So it has nothing to do with disenfranchising voters and a democracy. I love how they're voting in their primary is democracy, except when the DNC fraud lawsuit says that, hey, why did you cheat Bernie Sanders? And then the DNC lawyers say, well, we're a private entity. We can do whatever we want. We can choose our nominee in smoke-filled back rooms. By the way, the nominee will be Hillary Clinton. Pretty good. I waited until 11 minutes. Hillary Clinton's going to be the nominee and lose to Trump again. Although that's my prediction, but she could possibly win. Just saying. If she wins Pennsylvania, if she wins Maine, Pennsylvania, Iowa, and Wisconsin, she's won the election if everything stays the same. It's 269. It'll be tied in the Electoral College, and then the House of Representatives is the tiebreaker, and they're controlled by Democrats. So she would win the election. But anyway, my prediction still is that President Trump's going to win. But the prophecy, the biggest political prediction is not even what happens in the election. The biggest political prediction is that Clinton is going to be nominee. This entire thing has been a charade. But here, extending the date by which ballots may be cast, not just received by the municipal clerks, but cast by voters for an additional 6 days after the scheduled election day, fundamentally alters the nature of the election. Of course it does. And again, the plaintiffs themselves did not ask for that relief in their preliminary injunction motions. Of course they didn't, because they wanted to just add that in so they could cheat and then just count, oh wow, look at all these ballots. I mean, you look at the midterms, and it was like, how many close races, close calls, and it was just, guys, we're counting ballots again. And the absentee ballots and the mail-in ballots, or the vote tallies in Broward County. Just ask Tim Canova, and ask Bernie Sanders, and ask anyone in Miami what took place in Broward County, not just in 2018, throughout every election with Debbie Wasserman Schultz. But let's continue. Our point is not that the argument is necessarily forfeited. And again, the plaintiffs, our point is not that the argument is necessarily forfeited, but is that the plaintiff themselves did not seek the need to ask for such relief. By changing the election rules so close to the election date, and by affording the relief that the plaintiffs themselves did not ask for in their preliminary injunction motions, the district court contravened this court's precedents and erred by ordering such relief. The court has repeatedly emphasized that lower courts, federal courts, should ordinarily not alter the election rules on the eve of the election. Okay? So the unusual nature of the district court's order allowing ballots to be mailed and postmarked after Election Day is perhaps best demonstrated by the fact that the district court had to issue a subsequent order enjoining the public release of any election results for 6 days after Election Day. In doing so, the district court, in essence, enjoined non-parties to this lawsuit. It is highly questionable, moreover, that this attempt to suppress disclosure of the election results for 6 days after the election day would work. And if any information were released during that time, that would gravely affect the integrity of the election process. So, I mean, they wanted to have voters vote 6 days after the election, for within 6 days after the election. It's like, what? The dissent is quite wrong on several points. First, the dissent entirely disregards the critical point that the plaintiffs themselves did not ask for this additional relief in their preliminary injunction motions. Okay, and don't say, well, they sued in March and it got worse by April. It's like, well, you knew you were in a pandemic in March, in the middle of March. Okay, You shouldn't have listened to Cuomo on March 1st saying, "Oh, there's no need for undue anxiety. The general risk in New York remains low." Second, the dissent contends that this court should not intervene at this late date. The court would prefer not to do so, but when a lower court intervenes and alters the election rules so close to election date, our precedent indicates that the court, as appropriate, should correct the error. So they hide everything with, oh my God, you're hurting voters, you're disenfranchising voters. Like, well, you knew what was going on. You know that the deal, like Biden said, who won't be nominee. Third, the dissent refers to voters who have not yet received their absentee ballots. But even in an ordinary election, voters who request an absentee ballot at the deadline for requesting ballots will usually receive their ballot on the day before the day of the election, which in this case would be today or tomorrow. The plaintiffs put forward no probative evidence in the district court that these voters here would be in a substantially different position from late requesting voters in other Wisconsin elections with respect to the timing. In that regard, it bears mention that absentee voting has been underway for many weeks, and 1.2 million Wisconsin voters have requested and have been sent their absentee ballots, which is about 5 times the number of absentee ballots requested in the 2016 spring election. So Democrats just want to stuff the ballot boxes, and their voters are given every opportunity. And instead of simply playing by their own rules, or instead of simply A, canceling the election, B, postponing the elections because there was nothing, even the New York Times said they didn't postpone only because it was difficult to do so. Not impossible, difficult. And then the next issue is, well, just having all of these people in the rain vote. During a pandemic, in the rain. It's so absurd. It doesn't, and the media doesn't care. They're like, well, these people were braving the elements. It's like, no, they didn't have to. It was the Democrats who forced them, not Republicans or Trump. And I don't care about the Republican Party. I'm voting for President Trump. He's a great president. Does anybody understand? You have people who, just on a side note, he just signed a peace agreement to end America's longest-running military conflict. Nobody's talking about it on the left. Gee, I wonder why. Because they don't care. They only care if it's a Republican being accused or if it's a Republican starting military conflict. That's when they care. That's when all the moral outrage comes out. But here, give me your thoughts below. Subscribe to H.A. Goodman's other channel. If you want to support my voice long term, my Patreon is below. The sole question before the court is whether absentee ballots must now... Okay, so... Unbelievable. They wanted to extending the date, not just received for an additional 6 days after Election Day. They wanted to extend voting for an additional 6 days after Election Day. Sorry, Democrats, not going to do it. It's like, there's already problems when Democrats have, dates and deadlines and all this. Extending voting 6 days past Election Day, no, the Supreme Court's not going to allow that. And again, you didn't have to hold your 16 states postponed their primaries, and I'm not sure if any of those states had state elections, but they postponed. I'm sure they had to postpone the state elections as well. It was not impossible to postpone the state elections. So the fact that they didn't do so because of convenience, it just tells you everything that you need to know. Politics before health and work, by the way. Because Democrats now, the Washington Post, like, I don't know, you really want to open up the economy? It's like, well, if you're living in New York or New Jersey, then your governors and Michigan, 7 of the top 10 states had governors that are Democratic Party governors. They did not look into the future. You don't have to be Nostradamus to look into the future 2 to 3 weeks. They did not prepare their states for the calamity ahead. And those are, obviously, every state is important in this country, but we have 50 states. So the national economy, I don't understand why that still has to be shut down, the national economy, when you have the 5 or 6 top states are all Democrat. Of the top 7, 6 of the top 7, I believe, are Democrats. You can look at the New York Times. Give me your thoughts below. Share this segment everywhere. Share this segment for anyone who believes that the Republicans didn't allow the absentee ballots to be counted. It's like, yes, no, that had nothing to do with it. They just wanted to vote 6 days past the election. 6 days past the election. Give me your thoughts below. Thank you so very much. If you want to support my voice long term, my Patreon is below. Ladies and gentlemen, subscribe to H.A. Goodman's other channel.